This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hey guys, time to get in on the action for the biggest moments in basketball with Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projections, place your entry, and win up to 100 times your money. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit of up to $100. Just download the Prize Picks app and use the code GET100. That's code GET100 on Prize Picks for a first deposit match of up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more. Pick less. It's that easy.
We made this.
The truth is in here. This is our special Fight the Future Minute podcast. I'm Kurt North, and you are listening to our coverage of minute 53 of the X-Files Fight the Future. This minute begins at 52 minutes as a car drives past London's Royal Albert Hall and ends on 52 minutes 59 seconds with the first elder reporting the virus has mutated. To discuss this minute, I'm joined once again by Darren Mooney, a recurring guest. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm feeling second to none.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Are you going to get this over the next few minutes, fellows? You know, Darren is renowned for his puns and for his comments, so strap in and get ready. But Darren, we're talking about the next minute. We were talking about the Well Manicured Man and his introduction, and he gets a phone call, and he's called to London to see Strughold and the Syndicate.
No, Kurt, he's called to London, England.
London, England. Sorry, yes, England.
I love those little sort of titles. I love that it's, and again, it makes sense because obviously you don't want to assume that people know. But it's always funny when I see places that are self-evidently where they are just labelled with London, England,
as opposed to London, Australia, or something like that. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. So, what did you make to the next minute here? What did you make to it overall?
Well, I mean, the choice of London is kind of great. I mean, it works narratively, if not internally. It works narratively, as you point out, because the whole point is that we're seeing this through the well-manicured man's eyes. We're literally venturing into his world. And, London is a very different kind of, milieu for the X-Files. And again, this is one of the things where, obviously when we talk about the film getting, having a big budget and wanting to be a blockbuster, it's easy to talk about things like the underground alien spaceship in the third act, or even sort of like the special effect with the alien kind of stuntman costume and model work that we've already seen at this point. But a lot of the kind of transition into this just having a bigger budget, having a longer production schedule, and having kind of greater freedom is little touches like, say, the establishing shot at the start of this minute, where, as you point out, they pass the Royal Albert Hall and they go to Queen Alexandra House. But like in any other episode of the X-Files, to think of like the trip to Hong Kong in Apocrypha and Piper Maru, that would be like you get an establishing shot, which is either, in the best case scenario, is shot by a second unit team without any of the actors present, but more than likely when you're working on a TV budget is likely to be just stock footage followed by cut to an interior or a kind of a clumsily disguised exterior. I kind of love the opulence of having the car pull up, having actor John Neville show up in shot walking into the house as if to make something that is completely unnecessarily narratively speaking, but which is like, yep, we shot this in London, we took our production team over there, we took the actors over there, we took advantage of kind of the budget or the check that Fox wrote us to kind of do it in the most mundane sort of ways. And it's worth noting as well, and again, another detail that I kind of love is that like when the well-manicured man goes into the room, the Syndicate, which, it's not a small syndicate. The show does rather well in terms of populating the Syndicate to make it seem like it's actually a bunch of people rather than 3 people talking at each other. There are lots of shots of kind of groups throughout the show's run. The club in New York often has background people in it who aren't speaking, to give the impression that this is a kind of a consortium of people with like-minded interests that involves many, many powerful people. But I love that even in Fight the Future, to showcase that we have a bigger budget now, it's like, well, yep, our syndicate meeting is going to have at least 3 times as many conspirators in it, just to prove that we have that budget. But again, it doesn't necessarily make sense within the internal logic of the show for the meeting to take place in London. As they point out, Strughold has to fly to the meeting, and the well-manicured man still arrives late, which is, depending on how you look at it, either a power play or a kind of a reinforcement of that thing we talked about last time, which is how useless he is, or how kind of powerless or impotent he is. But it is kind of strange that despite the fact the film kind of hammers home the fact that the well-manicured man is kind of sitting on the outside of this group looking in, they brought everybody over. They brought the first elder and second elder and the cigarette smoking man over from New York. They brought, obviously Strughold, we've been told, in from Tunis and Tunisia. And presumably when you look around, there are some Japanese conspirators there as well. They look like they might have been flown in from Japan as well. And it's kind of strange that the movie is trying to tell you that the well-manicured man is kind of sitting on the outside of this group, that he's kind of in dissent, that they're not agreeing with him. And in fact, actually, they very clearly begun the meeting without him by the time he arrives, while still holding the meeting in his country for the first time we've seen in the entire run of the show. And it is an interesting kind of tension there, where you have the movie wanting to tell you that the well-manicured man's important, but also at the same time trying to tell you, yeah, but he's actually quite distant from the actual conspirators who are at play here. And it's kind of interesting to see the movie kind of trying to square that particular circle, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right with the authenticity is it's something really interesting. You mentioned about the second unit. Second unit was sent by Dan Sackheim was the actual person who was sent. And I think it was nice. 2 to 5 days, around 40 people. But just to get that authenticity to the shot. And
Sackheim's like a really good director. Again, we worked on the 3rd season of True Detective here, and obviously he's worked on the X-Files as well. But he's not a second unit director. He's a director.
Yeah.
He's which is incredible.
Yeah. So that just goes to show just how important it was. On screen, we see it for maybe 15 seconds, if that. But they did have the extra money. Whether or not it was just we'll spend the money or not, but it definitely feels that it's authentic in that way. As you say, you've got the Royal Mail van, you've got the London bus, the Rolls Royce. All of this gives you subconsciously, and obviously the weather, which helps, which gives you that authenticity to the movie. And I do appreciate that. But it's amazing to think that they sent a second unit with Dan Sackheim for 2 to 5 days, around 40 people. Just for those moments, we entered into this sort of building. It's a very old and austere type library looking building, isn't it? You mentioned about the Syndicate being broader and bigger in the film to make it feel like it's broader and bigger because it is a film, but also that the Gentleman's Club. The Gentleman's Club's always been a thing with New York City, and we've got it here in England, a very kind of looking, typical old kind of library kind of feel to it.
With a tiny television set, which I love. Which is we're so opulent. We spent all of our money flying everybody here. This was the only television set that we could afford.
The classic black and white CCTV 4x3 TV set. Lovely. But you say, so it gives you that grand, and also that kind of stylistic feel to an English kind of library kind of thing, doesn't it? That's the way that they're looking for it. Yeah. But the well-manicured man in this particular minute is positioned very much like the cigarette smoking has been in earlier episodes of the show. He's slightly an outside force to the darker collective, and he, especially when he mentions his grandson, he says, my grandson fell and broke his leg. So we're seeing him in kind of almost like a cigarette smoking man. Like Cigarette Smoking Man was in earlier parts of the show. Did you feel that was the way that they kind of went with it, and especially the mention of the grandson's leg?
Well, they do indeed. Well, it's particularly the way that the shot that it's framed and kind of cut, because it's very much like you have the shot of the large group, but that's defined opposite the well-manicured man. When he walks in the door, they part to make way for Strughold, but when you keep cutting back to Strughold, it's Strughold and everybody else, including the cigarette smoking man. And then you cut back to the well-manicured man standing alone, which is very, again, we're talking about being very efficient in terms of storytelling, communicating something quite clearly. Even if you weren't listening to the dialogue, if you were just watching how that scene's cut, you have this room full of people just stopping and staring at the well-manicured man who is effectively kind of put on trial and has to justify himself and has to excuse himself and explain himself. And again, that's what my grandson fell and broke his leg is. It's I'm late for school, I have a note, I promise. You wonder if he has a doctor's note in his pocket, possibly to explain this. And it does communicate that very effectively and very, very well. And another thing that it does really well, which I really like, and again, and I swear I'm not going to keep talking about this for the further minutes that we go into it. I think this will be the last time I mention it, at least while I'm on the show this time. But again, you have the kind of flex of, we're a blockbuster movie now, because it puts John Neville, who is, again, like, and I love John Neville, and I may be overstating this because I love him so much, but John Neville is, you could legitimately argue that he is a movie star. He obviously headlined like The Adventures of Baron Munchausen back in the 80s with Terry Gilliam. Now, I know that wasn't huge in the States, but it's a cult film. He's a recognizable face. And I mean, even in terms of the 90s, he was appearing in films like, say, Little Women, where he played the kind of Mr. Lawrence role, the role played by Chris Cooper in the recent adaptation as well. So, like, John Neville was an actor that you recognized. He was an actor who had been around, and if you were a casual member of the audience, you might just recognize his face. You might not know that he's John Neville, but you'd recognize him from things. And so what I like is that they immediately kind of like affirm the kind of hierarchy of the situation by cutting from John Neville, who is a foreign respected actor who has headlined his own movies and is respected internationally, and then kind of immediately puts him in his place by going, yeah, but we got Armin Muller-Stahl here, which is like the guy who was nominated for an Oscar 2 years earlier for Shine. Stahl is kind of, at the moment, he's kind of arguably at the peak of his career, at least in terms of kind of American pop culture. He'll be appearing in The 13th Floor, I think, the following year, and he'd appeared in a prominent role in The Peacekeeper the previous year, The Peacekeeper being the film that was designed to launch DreamWorks. So he's a big deal. And so it's very much, I kind of love that cut that they have between the two, where it's like, we have this respected British character actor that we were able to convince to be on our little TV show for the previous 2 seasons when we produced it, 3 seasons when we released it, and it's great that he's here. By the way, we have Armin Muller-Stahl, who is an actor who has an Oscar nomination, and there is no way we are going to convince him to appear in an episode of our little television show, because obviously that divide exists, which again is interesting, again, a relic of the 90s, Fight the Future being a 90s blockbuster, but you have that clear delineation between actors who appear on television and actors who don't, and you can arguably see it with Martin Landau, who has graduated from being an actor who appears on television in Mission Impossible to now being an actor that we can get because we're a film and we have a film budget. Also, we probably need to wrap that up and make it clear that he's not going to be appearing on the show, so we'll find a way to tidy that up. But that's a conversation I think you and I will be having later. And here you have Armin Muller-Stahl, who's like, yep, he's an Oscar nominee, and he's primarily just going to be here to be ominous, menacing, and vague, and kind of to establish a power dynamic relative to this other respected actor who does appear on television. And I kind of like that hierarchy that it exists. It's worth noting, by the way, that Stahl would actually appear in television in 2004, where he played the Israeli Prime Minister on The West Wing, which kind of gives a sense of how film and television became kind of porous in the 21st century, where you started seeing things like Martin Sheen obviously headlining The West Wing and Kiefer Sutherland headlining 24, and the idea of kind of movie stars and television stars kind of like blurring into one another and there being less of a firm delineation between the two. But I kind of like that Fight the Future has this very firm definition that kind of, Neville, he may have appeared in movies, but he's a TV actor, and we're putting him in a scene with Stahl, who is very much a movie actor.
I think I had this for a future minute, but I think we'll need to discuss this just because of the way the conversation's gone here. That what did you think to the actual casting, rather than Strughold as a character and John Neville and what you've said there, but casting of the film as a whole? When we've got, obviously you've got to have people like John Neville in because he's part of the tapestry of the X-Files, and William B. Davis is the same. But then you're bringing in the likes of the name fails to tell me, but the woman that was on the panel. Then you've got
Blythe Danner, yeah, and Glenn Headley that's a bartender,
yes.
yeah.
And then of course you've got Martin Landau as well. So What did you make to the casting? The fact that they did step it up, but to me, they didn't go like. I'm not saying by any means that Martin Landau wasn't A-list, but they kind of chose very, very carefully who they wanted to be within the show. I mean, as I say, Armin Muller-Stahl was, as I say, 2 years for The Shining. He was the pianist's dad, wasn't he? In that film.
Yeah.
But the actual way that they've casted the people and they've fit them into the roles that they fit them in. So, what do you think of that overall with the actual film itself?
Well, I mean, again, this is a situation where Landau is there for a very particular reason, which is that he's Mission Impossible. He's television royalty. He's a way of establishing kind of our lineage and where we belong. And again, it's worth noting that during the previous 5 seasons, Carter had largely steered away from kind of celebrity guest roles. And he talked in interviews about it being a conscious choice, how he didn't want there to be a situation where you were watching The X-Files and you were kind of taken out of it by the appearance of celebrities. And again, this is probably a discussion that you're going to have on the X-Cast when you get into the 6th season, into what is, dismissively referred to as X-Files Light, which I think is a very unfair label on it. I have a great deal of fondness for that early 6th season stretch as well. But where you see the show beginning to, having literally moved to California, having this large volume of kind of actors available to it, casting people like Lily Tomlin, Ed Asner, and obviously Bruce Campbell within the first stretch of episodes of the season, which kind of radically alters kind of how the X-Files works and its kind of internal logic, where you start getting stuff like, well, I recognize Bruce Campbell, I recognize Ed Asner, they're playing off their kind of archetypes, whereas previously, the show was like, we got Darren McGavin, and he's royalty. Like, that's very much where our head's at. And Fight the Future is interesting because it's positioned halfway between those two extremes, where the casting of Landau is very much like the casting of McGavin. It's like, we are affirming our lineage here. And in fact, actually, it's telling that, like, Landau worked with Mulder's father. So I should stop calling him Landau. Yeah. But you know what I mean? That the character worked with Mulder's father, because it's a way of kind of establishing that, like casting McGavin as the man who founded the X-Files, it's a way of saying, this is part of our heritage as a TV show. This is where we're coming from, and this is our statement of intent. Whereas the casting of Stahl, and again, it's kind of interesting because he's, nominally the most important person in the Syndicate. It's very clear, even from the way that, even if you didn't know the Struggle Mining Corporation, the fact that the cigarette smoking man is his errand boy, he's this receptionist, basically, who's like, you show up to this meetings, Strughold's going to be there. But even the way in which it's shot and framed, where Strughold is the only person who gets a chair, which is like, that's how you communicate how important he is to this meeting. And the fact that the crowd parts for him like the Red Sea parting for Moses as well, when he's addressing, the well-manicured man. But the cast, it's interesting that the movie didn't go with a big celebrity for that. Because again, Stahl, Oscar nomination, great actor, hugely respected. Again, kind of like John Neville in that he's an actor who brings a sense of prestige because he's worked in films that are foreign or that exist in the art house. And so, like, recognizing him, you're like, I know the face, but I'm not necessarily sure where I can place it. And if you do recognize him from a particular thing, it's almost like hey, we both have great taste. Kind of like that moment where it's like recognizing Baron Munchausen is like, yep, we both saw that kind of Terry Gilliam film, and we get it. We're on the same wavelength. We have the same mindset. And the casting of Stahl is, I think, kind of something more like that, where it's like, hey, he's an actor who is respected. He's an actor who, in the right circles, is seen as being an actor's actor, as opposed to going with a name. Because I'm fairly sure that, and again, not to berate my dad's knowledge of foreign film, I'm fairly sure he didn't recognize Armin Muller-Stahl. For a long time, my 10-year-old or 11-year-old self, the only thing I'd seen Armin Muller-Stahl in was this. And I think I then saw him in the 13th Floor afterwards. But again, there's a sense of him being there almost as a mark of prestige or of good taste, where it's like, we picked an actor who, if you recognize him, you know that he's done good work in the past, as opposed to, well, here's a big name, we just slotted in whoever we could fit. And again, it obviously works because the character has to be German for thematic reasons, because of what the film is trying to communicate with Strughold, and I suspect we'll talk about that in a moment or tomorrow in another minute. But like the character has to be German, that narrows down the pool. It has to be a German actor, and it has to be kind of a German actor, but it can't be somebody who kind of overwhelms the cast. It can't like knock everybody out. We can't be sitting there going, well, it's, okay, well, I know he's Austrian, but you can't be going, well, Schwarzenegger is secretly the head of the conspiracy, which I kind of like. I think the casting works very well in terms of balancing those extremes.
You're very right in the words "in a moment," because you mentioned a couple of things there with Star. Obviously, we're talking about the casting there, but we'll move into the character of Strughold. There's no, you mentioned about his introduction, it's like a parting of the sea, effectively, that everyone seemed to part way for him. There's no sense of any introduction for him at all. It's we're expecting the leader of this syndicate to come through, effectively. He's got a very relaxed wardrobe as well, which also emphasises that in that way. But I do think that we do need to talk about the connection to the Strughold Mining Company from Paperclip. Now, I appreciate that obviously this is a minute-by-minute film podcast and we are talking about the film, but the X-Files is inevitably going to be connecting to other episodes, and this one's a particularly poignant one. Kurzweil, in the earlier scenes, we get a very kind of oblique reference to the fact that he's an OBGYN and the effects that might have happened over the abduction arc for Dana Scully. But with this one, we're getting very much the kind of the Victor Klemper kind of thing with Paperclip. What did you make to those connections with the fact that it was Strughold and Strughold Mining Corporation and the references back to Paperclip?
And again, this is very much part of that same conversation that's been happening. And again, this is why I mentioned kind of yesterday, the one of the images of the film that stays with me is the idea of that kind of green playground built over a graveyard. Because, I mean, the Strughold Mining Corporation, is owned by Strughold. You can infer that there's a connection there. And it is, if Strughold is the most important conspirator, and you're entirely right, he's the one person who isn't dressing to impress anybody else at that meeting, which tells you everything you need to know even before he stands up and the sea parts for him. But I mean, it's very much that Strughold kind of, that name is important in the X-Files because it obviously alludes to Hubertus Strughold, who was the pioneering father of space medicine in the United States, who did a lot of research in terms of kind of getting people into space in the US space program, but who was also complicit in human experimentation during the Second World War as a Nazi, and was smuggled out as part of the eponymous Operation Paperclip. And again, this is one of the things where the show was very much kind of arguably ahead of its time. There was some discussion about this. There were multiple investigations while Hubertus Strughold was alive. He was exonerated twice, actually. 2 of the 3 investigations exonerated him from any participation in activity that would disbar him from participation or kind of remuneration by the American government in its space program. The 3rd investigation, which began in 1983, halted with his death in 1986. And again, you wonder, would they have actually gone into it? It was only during the 90s that you started to have these conversations about it while the show was on the air. And again, the 3rd season aired around the same time there was controversy around the Smithsonian exhibit around the Enola Gay and kind of dealing with the legacy of dropping the bomb on Japan and kind of come to terms with the Second World War and its legacy. And it's kind of interesting because actually in the years since the show brought the name Strughold up, and since the film was released with Strughold as the primary villain in the conspiracy, the head of the conspiracy, around about 2004, there was documentation uncovered that he actually experimented on epileptic children, and in terms of depriving them of oxygen, putting them in high-pressure chambers in order to simulate hypoxia, and various other horrific, inhumane activities, which are very much, again, one of the core themes of the show. You mentioned that idea of, obstetrics and gynecology, with, the books that Mulder picks up in the apartment. And again, this idea that runs through the show about the exploitation of women's bodies, but the exploitation of people's bodies and experimentation without consent, for what is deemed to be the greater good, which again is something that we associate with the Axis powers. I mean, 731 alludes to Unit 731, which was the Japanese, kind of, scientific body that conducted these horrific human experiments in Japan. they're conducted in, obviously concentration camps and in Germany as well during the Second World War. But also, again, the show makes the point repeatedly that they were also conducted, that the American government conducted these sort of experiments, stuff would say the MK Ultra, which is terrifying to read about, and kind of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment as well. And kind of this idea that it's all intertwined. And again, the Strughold idea, and I wonder kind of again, maybe we're stepping on the toes of the next minute, but just very, very briefly, the thing about Strughold that is so unsettling is the fact that, like, almost immediately it is transparent that he's a Nazi. And again, part of this, you can be very cynical and you can say, well, he's an older German man in a 90s American movie. That's shorthand for Nazi. But that's not it. The film goes even further than that. The fact that he's a German expat living in North Africa, which again taps into that idea of, like, the boys from Brazil, the idea that, after the Second World War, not all Nazis were prosecuted. Some of them fled, some of them were taken to the United States, some of them were actually integrated into positions of power and authority. But the idea that, like, where the conspiracy has found itself by the time you reach Fight the Future, which is the end of the Cold War, America as a dominant global power. But in the film, or in the world of the X-Files, all of that power is at the behest of a former Nazi. It's the kind of man who should be in prison, who should be tried, who should be exposed, who should, by all standards, probably be facing a death penalty, but is somehow controlling everything from the shadows. And again, that's the big fear of kind of the show. And you can see it in things like, say, the black oil. And again, the way in which the movie reconfigures the way in which the black oil works. It's something that gets in you and, it changes you in the show. It compels you. It takes over your body and it forces you to do things that you wouldn't want to do, which again is a metaphor for the idea, inherent in Operation Paperclip and inherent in the idea of the Strughold Mining Corporation, which is this German organization named for a former Nazi associated with Victor Klemper, who is a fictionalized version of that sort of former Nazi, which has somehow managed to dig deep, deep, deep beneath the surface of the American psyche, that's managed to ingrain itself, that's managed to kind of bake itself into the very fabric of the nation, to kind of drill into the ground and anchor itself in the nation in a very literal and physical sense, in a way that is deeply, deeply, deeply unsettling, in a way that kind of gives people pause. And again, that's a very kind of 90s anxiety. The show touches on it kind of a great deal. That's something very much related to the end of the Cold War, which is like, the Cold War is over. What do we do now? And a large part of what we do now is trying to figure out, was the Second World War, which is something that we treat as being an absolute moral kind of conflict, as being something that was inherently a battle of good versus evil. Was it as simple as we said it was? And more than that, did we learn the right lessons from it, or were we somehow tainted and corrupted by our actions towards the end of it in particular, and in the aftermath of it in particular? And kind of Strughold's an interesting character because he touches on all of those ideas without doing so directly. Nobody ever directly calls him a Nazi. Nobody mentions that he came over from Germany. All of that is inferred in the use of the name Strughold, the fact that he's cast using a prominent German actor, his accent, and the fact that he's living in Tunisia. But it's all very much there simmering beneath the surface and kind of ready to be picked at in a way that's communicated, again, to credit to the film, very, very, very effectively. Now, I will say on the casting, I do think that the casting of Stahl was perhaps not the most kind of planned out sort of thing, because you get a sense that, like, Strughold becomes an absence in some of the stories that are coming up. And it's kind of strange. You almost feel like Carter, when he cast the role, should have also made a point to sign Stahl to appear in, maybe one episode of the TV show, maybe 2 episodes of the TV show later on, because Strughold becomes this weird thing where he appears in the movie. He's kind of manifested and made flesh, and he's kind of introduced as a major player and a hugely important player. Then he just sort of disappears and goes away, and the kind of the conspiracy kind of boils down to what it was during the show, and it's never explained what happened to him or what role he played, and that's because Stahl is too big of an actor to be making a guest appearance on the X-Files on Sunday nights on Fox, which is kind of an interesting kind of paradox with the character. I don't want to call it a problem, but it's an interesting facet of the character.
Well, you mentioned Manifest, and he's pretty much born from the film itself, and is never really seen again. But something else that manifests and is mutated is a line that one of the First Elder says, doesn't he? He says, the virus has mutated, and that brings us to the final part of the minutes. That wraps up that latest Fight the Future minute for us. So thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back for the next minute 54, as the well-manicured man hears some shocking information from the Syndicate regarding that. So we're going into a conspiratorial, we're going into more sci-fi elements in the next few minutes. We've had the introduction, we've had Strughole's introduction, we've had the well-manicured man's introduction into the film, and now it's time to get into the really grimy and dirty aspects of the film when it comes to the Syndicate. So we'll be doing that tomorrow, doing that for the next episode. So yes, we'll be back. So remember, everyone, until the next minute, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. The time is now. A Millennium podcast.
I have actually seen the 2006 Asylum movie, The Da Vinci Treasure, which is one of these mockbusters or knockbusters. It's absolutely terrible, apart from one thing. The antagonist of that movie is played by an actor called Lance Henriksen. That's the only reason I watched it.
Right, okay. Right.
I watched it quite drunk, as I recall, which is probably the best way to watch it. But Lance is the only reason to watch that, so I'm not going to go and watch it. But it was very much a sort of knockoff of the same sort of storyline and so on. But yes, sorry, I've gone off topic there. But
it's okay. It's my fault for looking at my Dan Brown books and thinking, why did I buy them in the first place? But I was 18. I'll put it that I was 18.
We played this.
Where and when did your journey with video games begin?
You see, this is why I had to be honest about my age, because my first video gaming experience was the Sinclair Spectre.
Oh, Specky guy.
Well, you see, we didn't have anything like that in our home. And I was old enough to have had a 48K, but my dad kind of resisted. So we did get the 128K, and that had a built-in fucking tape deck, which was the coolest thing in the 80s.
Cinemortuary podcast.
Yeah, and they kind of run around hell a bit, which to be honest doesn't look that bad. It just looks a bit like a night out in Doncaster.
Yeah, it's just a bit janky, isn't it? They're just in someone's basement.
Yeah, exactly.
I believe this is where we get the only bit of tit in the whole movie as well.
Yeah, very briefly.
Very briefly. Very briefly.
It's there and it's gone.
The best part about this for me when I was watching it is at this point, just as they go into hell, my girlfriend stands up from her chair and tries to ask me what's going on.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.